I'd like to welcome you all. This is the third part of a three-lecture series dealing with the presidency, leadership, and the FBI in this particular case. This was supposed to be the unveiling of my book, Presidential Leadership and the Bureaucratic State. Unfortunately, there has been a little bit of a delay, not too much, but we will have another talk in September. And at that time, I could assure you I'll have copies of the book, and maybe some of you might be interested in reading it. The key point of today is that this discussion is a discussion about politics. It's a discussion about power. It's a discussion about personalities. It involves how bureaucracies, if you will, with ample resources and skilled political leadership can be a major impediment or check on presidential power. It is the study that involves the FBI under the directorship of J. Edgar Hoover from 1924 to 1971. 8 presidents. It is a tale of great success. The FBI became, in the judgment of many, the greatest law enforcement agency in the world. It developed the greatest crime and pushed the science of forensics to new heights, all while enduring skeptical criticism. The FBI was also part of an effort to protect the United States from internal security threats, domestic enemies engaged in terrorism, espionage, sabotage, including fascism, communism, radicals, and the Ku Klux Klan. It is also a tale of political manipulation, of ego, of shameless publicity and propaganda, of political accommodations, of black bag jobs, of snitch jacket, and political involvement by an agency committed to law enforcement. It is the story of the President and J. Edgar Hoover that were engaged in what I like to call a symbiotic relationship, okay? It is a story that the public has been given all sorts of accounts, many sensational, many biased, and many attempt to write or rewrite history for a quick buck. I will attempt to bring my knowledge to clear away some of the myths, some of the distortions, and some of the political biases. For that, I have to introduce myself. I know many of you know me, but I want to talk a little bit about my connection. In the mid-1970s, I was a graduate student at New York University, and I was fascinated by different topics, mostly, at that time, the Soviet Union and the power of bureaucracy. And my interests were heuristic and covered a lot of different areas, but quickly I moved into American politics, and my second interest was the Central Intelligence Agency and its involvement in politics. And then my third love, which ended up being a love that's lasted well over 35 years, a study of the FBI. In 1974, the Congress of the United States passed the Freedom of Information Act. And President Ford signed that act, and it basically said that all government documents would be made available to the citizens of the United States. I took that literally, and so I sent a letter requesting that the documents related to a program that I had heard about, the COINTELPRO, or Counterintelligence Program, would be released to me. I apparently did not read the fine print, and the fine print said that you could request, but that didn't necessarily mean you would receive. And so Freedom of Information had a few details that needed to be worked about. The FBI, of course, objected, which meant that one had to go to court and overturn those objections. And I quickly realized that as a graduate student, that was not going to be within my financial resources. So I was somewhat annoyed, somewhat angry, and I decided to move into other areas. I get a phone call from the Socialist Workers' Party. And the Socialist Workers' Party, which was also involved in this information that they were interested in, asked me to be part of their lawsuit. And I said, well, what do I have to do? And they said nothing. I said, well, that's exactly what I'd like to do. And they would cover all the legal expenses. And I said, gee, this is great. This is like Christmas coming in August. Well, a couple of months later, I get another phone call, and I found out we won. So I end up doing a Toyota Leap in my apartment, which defies the notion that white man can indeed jump. All right, so I did jump, and I realized that once again that this was going to be a great success. But the next day, I end up calling the FBI, asking for the documents. And adding insult to injury, they kept me on the phone for 6 hours. All right, and in that 6 hours, I realized that it cost me somewhere around $90 in the phone call. This were different times then in terms of what long-distance phone calls cost. But more importantly, they told me that I had to identify the documents that I wanted. Well, this was a catch-22. I didn't know which documents they were. And that meant specific documents, like a letter from Hoover to, let's say, William Sullivan or George Moore to Tom Houston. I didn't know the documents. I wanted to read the documents to find out the documents. Well, then things got worse. They said that I had to pay 10 cents for each page. And I did a quick calculation that would be $8,400. So again, I had to use my wits and find out, how am I going to get these documents? Well, originally I sent a letter to Nelson Rockefeller, who was the then Vice President of the United States. I sent the letter to Otis Pike. I sent the letter to Frank Church, to Jacob Javits, and I didn't get much response. Finally, my local congressman was a man named Jack Murphy, who happened to be involved in practically every scandal of the 1970s. Well, what a congressman. He found these documents, and he gave about 30,000 documents to me. And quick calculation, that's $3,000. He personally calls me up and says, do I need more? And of course, I'm the kid in the candy shop, and I say, yes, more. And he sends me more. And then eventually I receive other documents from Jacob Javits, and I go through 84,000 pages of documents. And I have to say that it was like being a political voyeur, which gave me insights into the presidency, into Congress, into bureaucracy. These were documents that were never meant for other people to see. And I believed I learned more from this than from any course that I took and from any other thing that I engaged in. So there was a sense that I was on to something. What I didn't know was that 35 years later, I'd still be using those documents, and I'd still be fascinated by them. And one of the things that emerges from all of this is that the political intrigue was fascinating. The personalities were even more fascinating. The sense of quid pro quo was beyond anything that I could imagine. I loved reading political science books, but this was real. This was authentic. These were exchanges that I wanted to know about. And what I quickly come to a conclusion was that J. Edgar Hoover was the greatest politician of his era. He understood quid pro quo. He understood how to exchange things that he had for things that he wanted. What he also knew was that there were partners, and these partners existed in the White House, they existed in the halls of Congress, they existed in other bureaucracies. In effect, one of the discussions that we talked about in these first two talks was the notion of transactional politics and transformational politics, and transformational leadership, where ideas become powerful. And one of the things that I've learned is that J. Edgar Hoover not only understood transactions, but he also understood the power of ideas, the power of ideology, and how ideology can be used to check members of Congress, to check presidents, and to have a loyal and intense constituency that would always be supportive of him. That's why I come to this conclusion that J. Edgar Hoover was one of the master politicians of his time. One of the things that I've done in the outline is to suggest that there were three areas in which bureaucracies can be deeply involved in politics. And they are the power of advice, the power of implementation, and the power of propaganda. And when we look at all of these, we begin to recognize that there are multiple dimensions within them. And when we look at the power of advice, what I'm going to suggest is not only was advice used in a manner, shape, and form to help the FBI, but that the advice was given in a consistent way, a way that promoted a set of ideas that was consistent with interest group support and was interested in developing a loyal following. In politics, no bureaucracy survives unless it has constituency support. Now, Herbert Simon, who was a political scientist who happened to win a Nobel Prize in economics, which just demonstrates how good we are, believes that the ability to shape the value on factual premises of decision makers is a means of ensuring control over decisions themselves. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that the FBI, under the directorship of J. Edgar Hoover, was able to shape how decision makers function. What they saw are the relevant facts, to give them a prism upon which they saw the world. And that this element of advice was critical in understanding the FBI's power. Let's begin with Franklin Roosevelt, because in the early years, under Coolidge and Hoover, Herbert Hoover that is, J. Edgar Hoover's power wasn't firmly established. He was, of course, a loyal aide to A. Mitchell Palmer, and A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General under Woodrow Wilson. And some of you are familiar with the Palmer raids, which are part of the first Red Scare, and a much more intense Red Scare than even later on with McCarthy. The Palmer raids violated practically every aspect of civil liberties and due process. But one of the things that J. Edgar Hoover learned, and he learned very early, was that communism as an instrument, all right, to pin your ideology on was going to be very, very powerful. In the United States, even though there were elements that were sympathetic to communism, there were notions of individualism, of limited government, there was the notion of religion, and that J. Edgar Hoover understood that being an anti-communist was not only going to be powerful in getting the Bureau, but it was also going to be powerful in getting the Bureau the intense support of large segments of the public. Now, a lot of people tend to believe that when you promote propaganda or advice or implementation, that what you try to do is unify. And I'm going to suggest that's not what you do. What you need to do is to polarize. What you need to be talking about is an evil. And an evil needs to be fought. If there are no evils, if there are no enemies, then there is no need for your existence. As a consequence, the FBI is going to be significant in terms of ideologically in contesting the forces within American society. And once this contest is confirmed, then people are going to join with them and join against them. And it is this battle, this dramaturgical joust that we might call, which gives the FBI even greater power. Now, I said I begin with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It is at this point that Franklin Roosevelt's power has dwindled somewhat. The 1936 election was successful. However, in 1937, we have the court packing plan, which reduced his popularity even among his own party members. We also know there was a second recession in that period, and as a consequence of the two, Franklin Roosevelt's power diminishes greatly. But what's interesting is 1936 and 1937, one doesn't think of foreign policy. But in the archives, in these 84,000 pages of documents, Franklin Roosevelt is talking about the U.S. war effort in Europe. Fascinating, right? The notion that years later, when letters from Roosevelt and Churchill are revealed, and Roosevelt says, "I will join you." Well, he was joining him a lot sooner than we had anticipated. What was going on? Well, the first thing that was going on was that J. Edgar Hoover apprised Franklin Roosevelt of Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin was interested in reclaiming parts of Mexico, and he wanted to send a General Butler, to Mexico to make sure that Mexicans and the Mexican government was going to function in a way that was conducive to U.S. interest. Roosevelt was interested, but he was more interested in communist and fascist. And the genius of Hoover is you have to know what people want, and then you have to give it to them. And one of the things that Hoover was able to do was to point out that communism had never left the United States. Even though many people thought it had subsided at the end of World War I, his arguments were that in organizations like the Longshoremen's Union under Harry Bridges, under the Mine Union of John L. Lewis, and under the Newspaper Guild, that the Communist Party was very, very powerful. Let me read what Hoover said. And I'm going to do this periodically because I think it gives authenticity to it. "I told him that my information was that the communists had planned to get control of these three groups, and by doing so, they'd be able at any time to paralyze the country, and that they can stop all shipping in and out through Bridges' organization, stop the operation of industry through the mining union of Lewis, and stop the publication of any newspaper in the country through the Newspaper Guild. I likewise informed them that all of the Communist Internationale in Moscow had recently issued instructions for all communists to vote for President Roosevelt and against Governor Landon because of the fact that Governor Landon is opposed to class warfare." Silly in some instances, but what he does is make it aware of Roosevelt that, one, the unions are powerful, that the unions may be sympathetic to communist points of view, that they may be sympathetic to the Soviet Union, even though Roosevelt had a relationship with Stalin at this time. But there was this fear, and then the fear that the communists might embrace Roosevelt, which Roosevelt, maybe the master politician of our era, recognized would be a death knell. So what Hoover did was to point out that there was a crisis. Not only did he point out that there was a crisis, but he pointed out that the FBI was the only instrument that could solve that crisis. And on top of that, what he then was given was the additional authority by the President of the United States to investigate these groups. So in other words, the FBI won on many, many levels. The President was relieved that he was given information that was critical for national security, internal security. It was protecting his political flank. And at the same time, the FBI was going to receive an important power position, additional resources, and authority. The relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and J. Edgar Hoover was a great one. And one of the things that Hoover was able to tell Roosevelt, we're better off not going public with this. We're better off not going to Congress. Because if we did, then we would be revealing our hand. And Hoover understood that there was an element of one of the appropriations law that said if the Secretary of State asked the FBI to investigate, then it would be legal. And it is this kind of political entrepreneurship that Hoover used consistently. And Roosevelt was very, very happy with all of this. We can also see that there were other issues. During this period, particularly once the war begins, Averell Harriman wants to create a relationship with the NKVD, which was the predecessor to the KGB, with the Office of Strategic Services run by Wild Bill Donovan, one of the great characters in American history. And Hoover warns Cordell Hull, warns Franklin Roosevelt of the dangers involved. And one of the aspects of all of this is that Roosevelt tends to side with Hoover. He always sides with Hoover on almost every issue. When it comes to internal security, national security, or politics, Franklin Roosevelt and Hoover become very close allies. As time goes on, we recognize that the threat of Nazism rescinds. And when Harry Truman becomes president, we now have the issue of loyalty. The Canadian Civil Service had a report about large numbers of communists within the Royal Civil Service of Canada, and Hoover seizes on that and goes to Truman and to Tom Clark, who was the Attorney General at the time, and suggests that they create the Attorney General's list. And the Attorney General's list was a significant thing because it not only identified communists, but it identified people who were part of front organizations. Organizations which weren't communist per se, but may have been created to avoid the stigma, the imprimatur of communism, but still perhaps supported Marxist-Leninist positions. Unfortunately, many of these organizations were also just goody two-shoe organizations which weren't that interested in politics. But the idea that there may be front organizations, dupe organizations, was something that seemed to be critical in the development of this power. One of the things that happens is that Truman issues a statement. And let me read this statement because I think it's critical. The forces which are most anxious to weaken our internal security are not always easy to identify. Communists have been trained in deceit and secretly work towards the day when they hope to replace our American way of life with communist dictatorship. They utilize cleverly camouflaged movements such as peace groups and civil rights groups to achieve their sinister purposes. While they are individuals or difficult to identify, the Communist Party line is clear. The first concern is the advancement of the Soviet Russia and godless communist cause. It's important to learn to know the enemies of the American way of life. What's fascinating about this is that Hoover is able to persuade Truman. Now, one's not going to suggest that Truman was hostile to this idea, but when you listen to Truman's statement, you would find it almost impossible to find any daylight between Truman and J. Edgar Hoover. They're on the same page. And the Attorney General's list becomes one of the major factors in how the U.S. government is going to operate. Now, of course, during this time period, one has to recognize that we're not only in the midst of the McCarthy situation, we're in the midst of the Rosenbergs, we're in the midst of questions of who lost China, and the whole debate is a question of loyalty. It's a question of competence. It's a question of whether there are internal columns, fifth columns within the United States. Certainly Hoover pushes this argument, and he's very successful in finding President Truman fully on board. When Eisenhower becomes president, Eisenhower didn't have the same close relationship that Truman had. Eisenhower was much more skeptical. Eisenhower viewed Hoover with a little bit of contempt. As a matter of fact, there's a great deal of battle over McCarthy and Eisenhower. Eisenhower didn't particularly care for McCarthy, and Truman believed that Eisenhower should come out and condemn McCarthy because McCarthy was going after George C. Marshall, and Marshall was Eisenhower's godfather, benefactor in the military. Eisenhower's position was McCarthy will self-destruct. And let McCarthy self-destruct. I don't need to expend my political resources. Hoover, who didn't particularly care for McCarthy either, because he felt that McCarthy was destroying the cause. It's not that he disagreed with McCarthy, but he believed McCarthy was a wild card, that McCarthy was too unsubstantial, that he was creating a diversion, and therefore people would look at all anti-communism through a negative lens, a lens of a man who was inebriated, a man who was making wild, unsubstantiated charges. So there's an interesting tension during this time period. So what happens is Hoover has less success with Eisenhower. But certainly there are a couple of things that happened during the Eisenhower presidency. Among them is the civil rights movements. We have Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. And then in 1958, we have the integration of Little Rock, Arkansas. And there are enormous racial tensions that are taking place. The question of states' rights, the questions of to what degree does the Supreme Court decisions need to be enforced? Who is exploiting the circumstances? And Hoover is able to present to Eisenhower that there is large numbers of communists who are part of the Little Rock demonstrations, and that the people who are pushing these things in the courts are also representative of communism. This Marxist-Leninist view is associated with the civil rights movements. While it doesn't have the power that it did under Truman, Eisenhower is certainly aware of it. During the Kennedy administration, Kennedy makes it clear that he is fascinated by communism. Matter of fact, one of the big things about the 1960 election that many people seem to forget was that Kennedy was a Cold War warrior. He believed that Eisenhower, the old man, as they referred to him, was actually irresponsible. He had allowed the French to be defeated in Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. He allowed Castro to come to power. He allowed the Soviet Union to leapfrog the United States in terms of missile technology and missile implementation. Matter of fact, one of the big issues in the 1960 campaign was missile gap. Missile gap. Allen Dulles, who was the CIA director, believed that Eisenhower was reluctant to spend money, reluctant to do what was necessary. And Allen Dulles briefed Kennedy, and it confirmed Kennedy's own notions that Eisenhower was asleep at the wheel. Now, the point that we want to make here is that many people like to project Kennedy as someone who had moved away from this notion. But one of the things that he and Hoover demonstrate is that there is a simpatico, if you will, dealing with the notion of communism. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee was an organization that Kennedy was concerned about, and what did Hoover do? Hoover pointed out that large numbers of these individuals were communist, and that they had found this as a mechanism to demonstrate that what was going on with Cuba, what may have been unfair, but that their objectives were not the interest of the United States, but the interest of Marxist-Leninism. Kennedy embraced that. There was also the question of civil rights. And one of the things that Hoover was able to present was that there were large numbers of people in the civil rights movement who were sympathetic to communism. Now, I know many people have seen many, many movies. And one of the things that emerges in these movies is that John Kennedy was intimidated, he was extorted. But one of the things that is quite clear from the readings is that Kennedy was very, very concerned about embracing civil rights, because he feared that if he embraced civil rights and some of these individuals turned out to be communist, that what would happen is that his administration would suffer the political consequences. Robert Kennedy is the individual who orders wiretaps on Martin Luther King and people like Stanley Levinson and Jack Odell. In those days, prior to 1974, the Attorney General had full authority to give wiretaps to anybody they wanted. The information may not be permitted in a court of law, but if you're just engaged in intelligence gathering, then the information was perfectly accessible to federal law enforcement. That changed in an important case called U.S. versus U.S. District Court. But that's much, much later on. The power of the Attorney General was critical. And during this time period, what we find is that Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and J. Edgar Hoover were all concerned about communism. Hoover is concerned about criticism of the FBI. He's concerned about promoting an idea of communism being a dangerous threat. And Kennedy is concerned about his political re-election and how things are to be perceived. We might call this a mutual accommodation. They may not have always been on the same page on every aspect, but clearly, this was part of it. And of course, one of the things that Hoover constantly reminded Robert Kennedy was that Robert Kennedy was the chief counsel for Joseph McCarthy, and that McCarthy ultimately relieves Robert Kennedy because McCarthy said it wouldn't be good to have two Irish Catholics investigating large numbers of communists who were very often WASPs and Jews and others. So he puts Roy Cohn in charge. But a little tidbit here. Robert Kennedy names his first son Joseph, all right? And everybody believes it's named after his father, but it's Joseph McCarthy who he's named after. So it's kind of interesting, the rat-tat-tat that goes back and forth in this notion. But one of the things that Hoover recognizes, and Hoover recognizes very, very clearly, is that while not all presidents are going to agree with him, he could find something that they want, something that they need, something that they may be afraid of. And Hoover and the Kennedys are one of the more interesting relationships. And we'll get back to this a little bit later. During Lyndon Johnson's presidency, Lyndon Johnson, of course, was involved in so many different aspects. Civil rights was key, but he also was concerned about communist involvement. He was also concerned about the Vietnam War. And the SDS was a major, major factor during this. And what Hoover was able to generate to Lyndon Johnson was that much of the opposition to the Vietnam War was not because of his policies, but because it would be in the interest of the Soviet Union and Marxist-Leninism to succeed. One could say that Hoover manipulated LBJ, that LBJ's ego in believing that what he was doing in Vietnam was the correct course of action. And of course, if the enemies of the Vietnam War were communist, it just reinforced that LBJ was doing the right thing. During the Kerner Commission reports, during the riots in places like Watts and Detroit and Newark, by the way, at this point, I was selling children's books in Newark, which is an interesting experience in my own right. And I was able to see firsthand some of the riots in Newark. But that strays from the point a little bit. The key critical area was that Otto Kerner was basically an individual who believed that social conditions had created the riots. And Hoover wanted to make sure that the Kerner Commission understood that while social conditions may have been significant, that there were people who were willing to exploit this. And the people who needed to exploit this were Marxist-Leninists, SDS, black nationalists. And in effect, the Kerner Commission became watered down to a large degree. And when Kerner wanted the raw data in which Hoover represented so many different personalities, he said he didn't investigate any individuals, he only investigated organizations. Hoover was always in a position to be powerful and never to let down his guard. All right? Clearly, there are so many things that emerged during this time period. But clearly, as we move to the Nixon administration, and by the way, the Nixon administration is the last administration, and Nixon was probably the most serious about removing Hoover, even though they were friends back in the 1950s. There was a mutual suspicion between the two men. And of course, one of the things that Nixon was upset about was that, and we're going to get into this a little bit later on, was that J. Edgar Hoover had done a lot of interesting political actions for previous presidents. And he knew a lot of it. He knew what he had done for Johnson, for Kennedy, for Eisenhower, for Truman, and for Franklin Roosevelt. And because the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, had pretty much changed the consensus in American politics, J. Edgar Hoover was now in his 70s. He felt more vulnerable. He didn't have the political support, and he was less willing to engage in some of what we would call the black bag jobs, the espionage, the political intelligence that was so critical for previous presidents. So there was an interesting tension. In fact, when the Pentagon Papers case emerges, one of the things that the Nixon administration does is that they are vitally concerned about the leaks, people like Daniel Ellsberg. And they ask the FBI to investigate, and Hoover says no. It's one of the first times Hoover said no. And what we have is the creation of the Plumbers. And the Plumbers were designed to investigate, to fix the leaks. And of course, people like G. Gordon Liddy were part of that, and ultimately the Watergate scandal emerges. But the Watergate scandal was a third-rate burglary. But the problem was that the Plumbers had been doing things that the FBI had done, and it was paid for by the committee to re-elect the president, and there was no lines of accountability. And as a consequence, when they were covering up for Watergate, what they were really covering up was for the black bag jobs on Daniel Ellsberg and Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. So all of these things sort of come together. But one of the things that emerges during the Nixon administration is once again the role of the New Left, the role of SDS. During the inauguration, one of the things is there's massive demonstrations in 1969, and the FBI finds out the CB radios and gets on the same frequency as the CB radios and directs different members to go in opposite directions, and the demonstration becomes a massive failure because they interfered with the logistics and the communications. Nixon was very grateful for those kinds of things. All right. Clearly, what I tried to do here is that threat assessment. How critical are enemies of the United States functioning within the United States with impunity? J. Edgar Hoover was very, very capable of persuading every president, primarily from Franklin Roosevelt to Richard Nixon, that the threat was real, the threat was significant, the threat was getting worse. And in each of those instances, what was necessary was more power to the FBI, more resources to the FBI, more authority that would be secretive for the FBI. In other words, win, 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 win. Right? And this is how genius in politics works. But I'm going to move into volunteering for political information, because I think this is one of the more corrupt areas. One could talk a great deal about threat assessment, and some of the threats were real. But when it comes to the FBI volunteering political information to presidents, the presidents become co-opted. The presidents become dependent on this. One of the things that happened early in Franklin Roosevelt's presidency was that when he would give speeches, sometimes there were telegrams that would come in large numbers. And Stephen Early, who was his secretary, we didn't call them chief of staffs in those days, every letter, every telegram that was sent that was critical of FDR was given to J. Edgar Hoover for investigation. Every single one. Time and time again. And then, of course, J. Edgar Hoover realized that in many instances, there wasn't a whole lot of sinister activity going on. Some of these people were just critical, particularly critical about entering World War II. Some of them might have been communists, some of them may have been fascist, but most of them were isolationist. So what Hoover recognized is, instead of wasting precious resources, what we can do is send these same individuals for IRS audits, all right? And of course, everybody knows if you've ever had an IRS audit, it takes up all your time, all your energy, and you are useless for that time period. The price, the penalty, if you will, for criticizing Franklin Roosevelt was that you were audited or you were investigated. And this was time and time again. During Truman's presidency, they actually created a newsletter called Personal and Confidential. And during this time period, what would happen is that Truman would be aware of members of Congress, members of his own cabinet, people who were engaged in sexual peccadillos, cheating on their spouses, you know, all the stuff that we like to talk about, all right? But Truman was the beneficiary of that information, all right? Why? Because information gives you leverage, and Truman appreciated the leverage, and Hoover knew that Truman would appreciate that leverage. During Eisenhower's presidency, they continued it. Most of the information was about Southern governors and members of Congress, representatives and senators. And clearly, one of the things that Eisenhower was willing to do was to listen. He loved to gossip. He mostly liked to listen to gossip. All right? And one of the things that it did was that when there were showdowns between different governors, it was made known to those governors that information about their extracurricular behavior was also available, all right? And that information could be leaked. And if that information could be leaked, it didn't have to be leaked by Eisenhower, it could be leaked by Hoover. Perhaps one of the more disturbing things took place during the Kennedy administration. Many steel executives wanted to raise the prices of steel in 1962. And the Kennedy administration was engaged in what we call jawboning. They don't use that expression too often, but basically what you have is government officials talking to the industry leaders to persuade them, pressure them to keep the price low. And the argument for this is that as the economy grows more industrial, there are fewer participants in the marketplace, and therefore there's not true competition, that the government has a role in doing this. We could argue whether this is a good thing or bad thing. But here's the point. Kennedy orders the FBI to, actually his brother does, to interview all steel executives at 3 in the morning, right? And then late at night. In other words, what they were being done was being harassed, all right? They were not allowed to sleep. It was almost like they were in a squad room being interrogated. And ultimately, the steel executives relent, and they agree to the jawboning targets that the Kennedy administration engaged in. But here's the interesting point. There was a New York Times reporter, Harrison Baldwin, who knew about some of the intrigue, the symbiotic relationship, if you will, between the Kennedy Justice Department and the FBI. And he started to write about it. And what they did was they ordered an investigation of Mr. Baldwin. And of course, they found a lot of things about Mr. Baldwin in terms of his personal life, right? That he was cheating. I believe he engaged in homosexual behavior. And this, of course, stopped Mr. Baldwin, all right? So again, this notion that one would want to use the FBI as a tool of power in politics. Years later, I went to the Kennedy Museum, and this was kind of embarrassing because I wanted to find out about the steel crisis. And they kept on saying, what steel crisis? I said, the crisis of 1962. Grant McDonald wrote a wonderful book about this. I read many things in the FBI reports, and they refused. They refused to give me any documentation. And at that point, I realized that the Kennedy Museum was a shrine and not a museum. All right, and clearly one was not about to engage in this. During the Johnson administration, they had a very interesting relation. A man named Carter Delosh was a prominent FBI official. He was the head of what we call the Crimes Records Administration, which was their PR division. But he also had become very powerful in the American Legion and had become the top man in their public relations. And Carter Delosh was a man who was politically sympathetic to Lyndon Johnson. And one of the things that Lyndon Johnson asked him directly, not Hoover, to give me as much information about as many political figures as you can. And Delosh delivered, with the blessings of J. Edgar Hoover. Now, interesting enough, this stuff gets worse, because it's in 1964 that the greatest threat, according to Teddy White, in the making of the president, takes place in Atlantic City during the Democratic Convention. There is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and it's has a lot of sympathetic supporters, like Martin Luther King and Floyd McKissick and Eldridge Cleaver. And they have the opportunity to disrupt the convention. And during this time period, the FBI becomes essentially a servant to Lyndon Johnson. They give information about where they're gathering, what they're saying, what they plan to do, and then engage in counterintelligence to tell them that instead of 3 o'clock, it's going to be 6 o'clock. They tried to create enmity between different factions within the Mississippi Freedom Party, and in effect, the demonstrations become wilted. The interesting notion here is people like Bill Moyers and Walter Jenkins were coordinating these efforts. Now, when I see Bill Moyers on TV, and one looks like he's as clean as the driven snow, I remember 1964. Well, I don't remember it all that well, I have to admit, but I do remember reading about 1964 quite clearly. In addition to that, what we see during this time period is a situation which we would sometimes call name checks. And name checks are really another way in which the FBI had an opportunity to investigate people, all right? And very often, what administrations would do is they would say that they were going to appoint a journalist to a high-level political position, and that would give them an opportunity to investigate the SOBs, all right? So people like Joseph Kraft and David Brinkley were investigated during the Johnson administration. Daniel Shaw was investigated during the Nixon administration. Now, I could tell you, there was not one chance, one iota, that any of these people were going to be appointed to any position. This was the rationale, the excuse to investigate and find what they could to engage in character assassination. Spiro Agnew wanted to knock down Ralph Abernathy, who was the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And basically, he asked the FBI for information on his personal life, his relationship with the Black Panthers. Clearly, what Spiro Agnew wanted to do was political. It had nothing to do with security. But then, once again, we go back to Bill Moyers, one of my favorite whipping boys today. Because in 1964, one of the things he asks is that every member on Goldwater's staff be investigated. Every member on Goldwater's campaign committee be investigated. Looking for dirt, right? Now, I understand, we call that opposition research. The thing is, do we want the government to do it for one political candidate over another political candidate? And clearly what this suggests is that we are engaged in a situation where the FBI found very willing partners in American presidents to do their bidding. Now, I'm going to make a strategic decision here, and since a lot of stuff that we talked about also involves implementation, I'm going to move to propaganda, because I love propaganda. Propaganda is an Italian word, and many people associate propaganda with dictatorships. And clearly, Mussolini is the first individual to use it in an official manner. The use of mass media in highly industrial societies to persuade the public. Well, the word propaganda is actually more neutral. It deals with the notion of communication, all right, via various media sources. But the point that we want to make here is that the FBI understood that propaganda is an important tool and can be used very effectively to get their message across. And they could also use propaganda to identify enemies, to reward friends, and to succeed politically. When we talk about this, we like to talk about a mass media program. And the mass media program is a fascinating one. Whenever you're dealing with crime, criminals, high-level personalities, many people want to write about it. Many newspapers want to be engaged in it. And one of the things that the FBI knew, particularly J. Edgar Hoover, was that this was a great resource that we should use very judiciously. And therefore, the only people who would have access to our information would be people who would be sympathetic to our cause. And that they would only be allowed to write if they wrote things that were uncritical about the FBI. Now, Don Whitehead, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner, first and foremost with the New York Herald Tribune, fit that description. And he wrote about the FBI, about its exploits. He talks greatly about how J. Edgar Hoover saved the nation from the NKVD having forces here, talks about the heroicism that was involved with the FBI in dealing with bank robbers and dealing with communists. And when someone read the FBI story, one comes across that the FBI was apple pie, motherhood, and Americana, right? He also wrote an interesting book on the attack on terror. And the attack on terror was the FBI's role in dealing with the Ku Klux Klan. By the way, J. Edgar Hoover took a lot of pride in the battle against the Ku Klux Klan. And he was very, very angry when Martin Luther King attacked the FBI, saying that they didn't do enough on civil rights. And this personal pick and anger between the two men become quite significant. But I mentioned that as an aside. The Ku Klux Klan attack, all right, or the attack on terror, was a major part, again, for Don Whitehead and the FBI to come across with the notion that the FBI was professional. The FBI was concerned about all people, was concerned about civil rights. And this was critical in Hoover's notion of how to promote himself. One of my favorite areas was the program, the FBI. Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. Was the main actor. He was thoroughly investigated, found out that he was as clean as a hound's tooth. All the stories on the FBI were approved. There were FBI agents who, Dick Duce, who was there to help with all the production. He made sure that the FBI were presented in the most positive light. Right? They didn't chew gum. They didn't abuse citizens. They treated everybody with respect, and they followed the law. And if anybody was made free, it was because some mushy-head judge, all right, with some notions of justice which were clearly out of the mainstream, was the reasons for their lack of success. The FBI was produced by Quinn Martin, and Quinn Martin was known as a great sympathizer of the FBI and promoter of FBI values. The FBI was presented in that series as the savior against communists, the savior against criminals, the savior against the enemies of America. It lasted for 9 years, and when the 9 years were over, Quinn Martin used Thursday Night at the Movies on CBS to produce a series of other movies, including replications of Don Whitehead's The FBI and The Attack on Terror. There were many other things that existed, other movies, radio shows. One of the gimmicks that was used was the 10 Most Wanted. The 10 Most Wanted was initially part of a radio show. And one of the things that they found is if they identified the 10 Most Wanted, 3 or 4 people would be found almost immediately. All right? But it wasn't always by the FBI. Sometimes other people, other law enforcement found it. But the FBI FBI took credit for it. And then there became manipulation here that some of the 10 most wanted weren't really the 10 most wanted, but the 10 most easily found. All right, which of course, again, politics has its own way of doing things. My favorite, of course, is the production of Masters of Deceit. This is the magnum opus of J. Edgar Hoover. In Masters of Deceit, he talks about the nefarious methods of communism. He talks about how there are fellow travelers, there are dupes, and to the degree in which Americans may not be aware of how cynical these forces are. The problem was, however, that J. Edgar Hoover didn't write the book. Fern Stuckenberger wrote the book. And Fern Stuckenberger was on the FBI payroll as an agent. All right? And as an agent, Hoover made sure through his other aides that the FBI was presented in the most positive light, that the FBI was presented in a manner that was anti-communist, that there were enemies out there, and that these enemies needed to be confronted. These enemies needed to be treated seriously. And on top of everything else, the FBI Recreational Fund would be able to buy large sums of these books. Now, some of you may not be aware. I became aware when one of my books I thought had a chance to become a bestseller. It did happen, but it came near, is that the New York Times makes the bestseller list, and there are other bestseller lists now, based upon demands in the bookstore. So the first thing that J. Edgar Hoover did, and he was a master at this, was to make sure that the Recreational Fund bought 20,000 copies of Masters of Deceit. And once you had 20,000 copies spread out over many, many cities, Masters of Deceit became #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And what we know is that when people see things on the bestseller list, they immediately buy it because it has to be good. So it becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. And these are the kinds of things that become critical in understanding how the FBI became very, very powerful. One of the things that we should also mention was that J. Edgar Hoover wrote a series of law review articles. And I think he was a genius in many ways, but I don't think he was. He went to George Washington Law School at night. I don't think anybody would consider him a legal scholar. But he was very, very aware that his image was critical, and his image had to be sustained. So he had a series of ghostwriters. Ghostwriters who wrote Masters of Deceit, wrote law review articles for St. John's Law Review, Syracuse Law Review. He gave important speeches. He testified in front of Congress. He had some of the greatest displays ever made. And one of the things that J. Edgar Hoover fully understood and embraced was the notion of publicity and the notion of demonstrating that he could control the threat that existed. There was a serious threat. There was a communist threat. At some point in time, there was a fascist threat, but now it's a communist threat. It is real. They are devious. It is powerful, but he can cope, and he could be immensely successful. Hoover understood that there has to be drama. You cannot succeed without enemies. Enemies are an important element in politics. If you want to succeed, you need to overcome some obstacles. You need to overcome forces which are very often nefarious. You need to overcome forces that, if you are unsuccessful, have dire consequences. Hoover was one of the great geniuses, political geniuses, in understanding political theater. Political theater is critical. People want to know what is out there. Why am I endangered? How do I cope with this danger? And one of the things that becomes important is what we sometimes call symbolic political leadership. Hoover could cope. Hoover had answers. Hoover would be victorious. When they had the 10 most wanted list, Most of the people on the 10 most wanted list, they already knew who was to be arrested, all right? They would have all sorts of demonstrations in front of Congress where Hoover would testify. And when Hoover would testify, he would demonstrate that for every dollar that was spent on the FBI, $1.33 was returned in stolen property and other false claims against the nation. He was a master propagandist. He was a master politician. He understood the need to work with other individuals for their interest. He understood the need for publicity. He understood the need for veiled and thinly identified threats to the nation. And Hoover manifests himself in such a fascinating way that one of the things that he creates is the FBI laboratory. And a lot of people have poo-pooed this whole idea. Matter of fact, I was watching the movie J. Edgar, which of course is a silly movie in so many ways. Anything with Leonardo DiCaprio in is silly. But that's my own opinion. The key element is that this lab that he created was a fascinating lab. This lab became the model for all the CSI shows that we see today. And the idea was that this laboratory would be the critical elements in turning law enforcement into a science, and to make it so powerful and so convincing that the United States, with the FBI, with J. Edgar Hoover in charge, would be able to defend America, all right? One had to believe that there was a threat. If there is no threat, there's no need for the FBI. If the FBI is not competent, then there is no need to have the FBI. So what was needed very often was a master showman. And J. Edgar Hoover was one of the great master showmen of our times. He dies in 1971. And I was watching the movie over the weekend because I felt incumbent that I should at least be aware of Clint Eastwood's presentation. And of course, a lot of suggestions here about J. Edgar Hoover. One of the things that's missing in the movie is the notion that J. Edgar Hoover was a master politician, right? The reason why he was so successful was that he understood other people's needs, right? And he was able to meet those needs. And most of those people were presidents, chairmen of different committees. One of the more interesting individuals was a man called John Rooney, who represented this district in Congress for many, many years. And by the way, a St. Francis College graduate. All right? Not all of us have done badly. I didn't graduate from St. Francis, but I've been here 34 years, so I consider myself part of the problem. No, or part of the solution. The reality is that John Rooney and J. Edgar Hoover understood that the FBI had an image to protect. It needed to have enemies. It needed to be victorious. It needed to show a level of competence. But without enemies, all right, it's very difficult to sustain public support. It's very difficult to get large sums of appropriations. It's difficult to get public support in terms of laws which are going to give the FBI the authority to investigate, the authority to create its labs, to create its recreational facilities. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was able in many ways to take power, understand needs of American culture, understand the elements of politics in terms of interest groups, in terms of publicity, and then go to the needs of members of Congress and needs of the various presidents. He operated on multiple levels. In many ways, he was one of the greatest politicians of our time. His legacy is an interesting one. The FBI, in many ways, is the greatest law enforcement agency in the world. It pioneered scientific methods. It was using the Miranda warning 40 years before the Miranda warning was implied in the United States on state and local police levels. He was opposed to the internment of the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians because he figured that that was a slap in the face of the FBI, that they had not identified the enemies of the United States. All right? J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI are part of the American scene. And to understand American politics, to understand the notion of communism and anti-communism, to understand the power of bureaucracy, to understand the power of the presidency, to understand the clash between presidents and bureaucracies, I have found this fascinating. I have found that the study, the interaction, the interchange, the conflicts are among the most noble, the most savage, the most interesting, and of course the most perplexing in American history. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I'll repeat the question. The question is, if the FBI needs to investigate, do they need a warrant? In 1974, in the case of U.S. versus U.S. District Court, all right, they would engage in, prior to that, they would just investigate. If they weren't presenting the information, all right, to a court for the purposes of prosecution, they did not require warrants. But after 1974, they did require warrants, all right? Now, that is for domestic security. For foreign security, the U.S. versus U.S. District Court does not apply 100%, and the FBI would be authorized to investigate. So the rationale would be very different. For many, many years, FBI directors were federal judges, all right? Webster being the longest-serving judge as FBI director. And that was the idea that a judge would be more temperamental or moderate in this use, all right? Right now, Robert Mueller was a former U.S. attorney. And so even though Hoover was an attorney, he never really practiced, if you call it practice. So the FBI is far more limited now. And then, of course, in 1975, there was the Church Committee report. And then there were books like mine that came out, read by millions, I'm sure, that have changed some of the culture and the trust of the FBI, and certainly unveiling behind the curtain some of the political machinization left some of the trust of the FBI pretty much in a much lower level. Okay, the question is, what is the difference in jurisdiction between the CIA and the FBI? Well, in 1947, when the National Security Act was passed, against the FBI's suggestion, the J. Edgar Hoover wanted both domestic and international security. But they created the Central Intelligence Agency. And the Central Intelligence Agency would deal with foreign, while the FBI would deal with domestic. But there's an overlap, and some of the criticism of 9/11 was that the CIA had information, the FBI had information, and they weren't sharing, that there was a wall, all right? Some of that has changed in the aftermath, but there are still jurisdictional questions. J. Edgar Hoover had recommended something the equivalent of the KGB. I mean, obviously it would be an American KGB, but it would be one agency dealing with foreign and international. So there are those differences. The question deals with the depiction of J. Edgar Hoover in the movie J. Edgar. There are a lot of distortions in the movie. There is always the suggestion that he is egomaniacal, and there are elements of truth to that. But his success would have only been possible if he understood the needs of other political actors. Let me give you an example of that. In the discussion that he has with Robert Kennedy, and they are discussing the question of wiretapping the the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the depiction of Robert Kennedy there is, Mr. Hoover, this is the past, all right? The FBI could only be, what happened in the Palmer raids was a long time ago. Well, that's simply not true, all right? Robert Kennedy was deeply, deeply concerned about what Martin Luther King was doing. He was afraid that if Martin Luther King was identified with communists, was a communist, that could sink John F. Kennedy's re-election. And he was reluctant to embrace until he knew. There was also, part of that wiretapping situation, all right, was the notion of the sexual activities that were going on. And without going too much further into this, because in September I'm going to be talking about the FBI and Martin Luther King in a separate lecture, there was sex. And most of the sexes were prostitutes, all right? But during the sexual episodes, mostly Martin Luther King was a voyeur, all right? And part of what was going on was the making fun of the Kennedy brothers. And what Hoover was astute at was reporting back to Robert Kennedy some of these comments. And rat-tat-tat that went on back and forth. But Robert Kennedy was extremely cynical of Martin Luther King. He was extremely cynical of the civil rights movement, its association with communists. You have to remember, when Robert Kennedy named his first son Joseph Kennedy, everybody in the world thinks it's after his father, but it was Joseph McCarthy that he's named after. Robert Kennedy's position in that movie was completely distorted. Robert Kennedy was a hard-knuckles politician who was there to protect his brother and protect his political base, and was very, very cynical about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King in particular. It didn't mean that he wasn't sympathetic at some level to what was happening to American blacks, but not at the cost of Kennedy's re-election. And if you remember, in the 1960 election, the South went solidly for John Kennedy. And John Kennedy was always aware of this situation where, in some levels, he wanted to move away from that, but this was critical for his political support as well. All right, so we like to look at what happened in Illinois and what happened in Texas in 1960, because everybody knows what happened in Illinois, particularly Cook County. About 72% of the machines went down at 8:02. All right, the chances of that happening are very remote. All right, at that time, Richard Daley was more interested in electing a state prosecutor who was going to be sympathetic to the Daley machine, rather than Kennedy, who he couldn't care less about. But if he was throwing the election, why not throw the election for Kennedy and build up some IOUs as well? So I think what the movie suggests is that we have Hoover as a neurotic, Hoover as a cross-dresser to some degree, Hoover as purely egotistical. There are elements of that are true, all right? But what is more true is that here was a man who understood politics, who understood the needs of different members of Congress, the needs of different bureaucracies, the needs of presidents, and he was able to deliver those needs. This was quid pro quo. This wasn't intimidation. There were elements of intimidation, but there were elements in which Hoover fully understood the body politic. He understood what people needed, and he gave it to them if they would give him something in return. And what did they want in return? He wanted authority. He wanted resources. He wanted the prestige of the agency. But Hoover also believed in his cause. I mean, his biggest cause was J. Edgar Hoover, but that doesn't mean that he didn't believe in anti-communism, that he wasn't worried about the security of the nation. He did believe in those things. He may have had a distorted view, according to some, of those things, but he clearly had an ideological view. But the movie, you know, was this neurotic figure that Leo DiCaprio portrays, he would not have been that successful in dealing with so many members of Congress, so many presidents, so many interest groups. All right? He was wildly successful. Matter of fact, I'm going to leave you with this. In 1951, when Bobby Thompson hits the home run, all right, in the Polo Grounds, he is there, all right? He is there with Frank Sinatra, Jackie Gleason, and Dean Martin, right? He was dating Dorothy Lamour. I mean, a lot of interesting aspects to Hoover. Hoover's not the straw figure that he's presented in the movie. If he were, he would not have been as wildly successful. He was one of the most astute, dynamic politicians of his age. He did a lot of good, he did a lot of bad. The new book is coming out. It should have been out today, all right, but it will be out probably in June, and it's called Presidential Leadership and the Bureaucratic State. And in September, I'm going to be talking about the FBI and Martin Luther King, which is one of the key chapters, and I'll be signing copies as well on that occasion. Now, there's a previous book called Ideological Warfare that came out in 1983. I wrote it, yes. And the FBI has been part of me in all the books that I have written. I always find some aspect, either from the theoretical aspect, the notion of exchange, the notion of ideas in politics, various relationships, to be critical in my understanding of American politics. The FBI laboratory is one of the great achievements of J. Edgar Hoover. Many people were skeptical, fingerprinting, forensic science. He deserves a lot of credit for that. He also created the FBI Academy, which upgraded police standards across the country. And when we talk about some of the politics involved here, members of various police communities all wanted to go to the FBI Academy. And once they went to the FBI Academy, they had wanderlust. They were now part of the FBI, the G-Man imagery. And they were very often promoted in their local police departments. And what Hoover did was to create this symbiotic relationship between local police departments and the FBI. They engaged in cooperation. They engaged in giving the credit to the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was a genius politically. And the laboratory and the FBI Academy were two of the ways in which he forced it. He also had a great relationship with the American Legion. All right, the American Legion had an interest in demonstrating that veterans were very, very important for the defense of America. And at the end of World War II, there was the notion, well, maybe we don't need to support our veterans. Well, the American Legion was an instrument by which the FBI could use to constantly relay the threat, mostly the threat of the Soviet Union. And in many ways, the FBI and the American Legion became very interrelated organizations because the FBI could not reveal some of its information directly. They would leak a lot of information to the American Legion, and the American Legion would talk about the threats of the Soviet Union, the threats of the People's Republic of China, the communist movements, the anti-war movements, the civil rights movements that may have had communist levels of interference. So what Hoover understood is that you needed interest groups, and the interest groups of the law enforcement community, which I believe is 400,000 people in the United States. The American Legion at that time had millions of people, but it also had prestige. So Hoover understood that it wasn't just advice and implementation and propaganda. He needed other people to help him with the heavy lifting. And he also understood he had to do things that were in their interest. Mutual gain through trade, I guess, is the Adam Smith notion. If we want to use the Tip O'Neill notion, sometimes you have to go along to get along. It would have been a demotion. No, he had no desires to do that. He was concerned with each new administration whether he would be reappointed. All right, he was concerned about that. But no, he wasn't interested in elected office. And I do believe he felt that the position he held was the single most important position in the nation, and that anything else would have been a demotion. And consequently, he was there until his death. And interesting enough, I wanted to say one other thing. I interviewed H. Mark Felt. H. Mark Felt was the deputy after Clyde Tolson had a stroke. And I also interviewed Wallace LaPrade. And I interviewed both of them, actually Wallace LaPrade, while he found out he was being indicted. But H. Mark Felt believed deeply and strongly that he should be the new FBI director. And when Richard Nixon appointed L. Patrick Gray, all right, Mark felt betrayed, and he became Deep Throat, all right, which was the undermining of the Nixon administration of Watergate, because as the deputy director of the FBI, he had all sorts of information, and he led Woodward and Bernstein to create the investigation, which ultimately led to the Irvin Commission report and then the impeachment recommendation. Nixon, of course, resigned before he was impeached. But it all goes back to J. Edgar Hoover, H. Mark Felt, J. Edgar Hoover being reluctant to investigate the Pentagon Papers,